¿Es posible estarse mintiendo a uno mismo? Espectacular la pregunta. Es una de las características más llamativas del ser humano. Pareciera ser la única especie con capacidad de autoengañarse. Sin lugar a dudas que uno tiene que distinguir la diferencia entre la mentira y el error. Ambos pueden presentar una falencia, pero sin embargo la mentira es hecha a propósito. Ambos presentan algo que no es cierto, que no es veraz, pero la diferencia es que la mentira es a propósito. Y cuando uno se autoengaña, significa que estaría mintiéndose a sí mismo, estaría yendo en contra de algo que la mente me mostró. Por eso los antiguos definían que era una locución contra la mente. Era algo contrario a la mente. Es muy llamativo cómo la persona que de algún modo se autoengaña se va lastimando. Los psicólogos hablan de disonancia cognitiva porque el autoengaño genera un grado de tensión mental porque mi modo de actuar no es acorde a lo que estoy pensando que corresponde. De algún modo podríamos utilizar la frase de Paul Bourget. En una novela maravillosa él va a decir: el que no vive como piensa termina pensando como vive. De alguna manera, cuando no soportamos esa tensión de darnos cuenta, por ejemplo, que algo está mal y lo hacemos igual, nuestra mente, diría de una forma caprichosa, empieza a buscar una serie de argumentaciones, busca argumentaciones falsas, pero que sostengan su modo de obrar, como que justifiquen. De una forma caprichosa buscamos no sentirnos culpables. Por eso me parece muy interesante aprender a educarse en reconocer las propias mentiras que uno se dice y enfrentar la vida con responsabilidad. Si me doy cuenta que me he equivocado, buscar corregir ese error. Si el error que he cometido ha sido por ignorancia, buscar formarme para revertir ese error o no cometerlo en el futuro. Y si me estoy mintiendo, enfrentar la verdad, porque en esa verdad hay un algo que me redime, que me cambia, que me mejora. Quien haya leído Crimen y Castigo de Dostoyevski se da cuenta que enfrentar las propias mentiras es el drama del personaje principal, Raskolnikov. Pero como esta pregunta verdaderamente es profunda, no va a poder ser completada en un reel. Prefiero hacer una clase un poquitito más larga que la publico en la historia o en YouTube para que puedas tener una idea más profunda sobre lo que es la mentira y la verdad con uno mismo. Sumamente interesante el tema de ser veraz versus ser mentiroso, porque va a decir muy bien Francisco Letizia, citando a Romano Guardini, que los hombres somos seres misteriosos. Si alguien se pone frente a nosotros, podemos ver su exterior, oír su voz, apretar su mano, pero su pensamiento íntimo es difícil de conocer, está como oculto. Va a decir, cuando se encuentran dos personas, se produce el hecho intranquilizador de que el trato de los hombres entre sí es una relación que va de un ocultamiento a otro. ¿Qué es lo que forma un puente? La expresión en el rostro, los gestos, la actitud, cómo actúa, pero sobre todo la palabra. Por la palabra trata el hombre al hombre. Cuanto más digna de confianza es la palabra, más seguro y fecundo es el trato. Por eso, vos, yo, en tus amistades, en tus relaciones, es importante ser veraz y encontrarse, reconocer a las personas que buscan ser veraces. Francisco Letizia, citando a Papini, nos va a decir que es muy común en el hombre mentir. Miente el político por razones partidarias y el orador miente desde su cátedra. Miente el fanático por fanatismo, el imbécil por imbecilidad, el amigo por defender la amistad. El uso de la mentira es tan universal que nosotros ya nos recordamos que cada uno miente a seres que también pueden mentir. Por todas partes los oídos no oyen más que mentiras gritadas. Los ojos no ven más que mentiras impresas. Los carteles de las esquinas son tan engañosos como los charlatanes de las plazas. Los periódicos son amasijos de falacias y los cementerios son los archivos de la impostura duradora. Va a decir en forma maravillosa Letizia, la verdad da al hombre firmeza. Es cierto que la vida es lucha y que siempre nos acechan suspicacias, envidias, celos y odios. En esta lucha diaria la mentira y el engaño parecen ser útiles, pero la experiencia nos enseña que la verdad, a la larga, siempre prevalece, y que solo la honradez y la lealtad dan solidez a la vida. Finalizo con un extracto, una selección que hice de una conferencia de Jordan Peterson, donde psicólogo clínico, profesor que estuvo en Harvard y actualmente en universidad en Toronto, él va a decir que fue toda una búsqueda interior aprender a ser veraz, a ser sincero, aprender a dejar de lado las mentiras. Maravilloso.
You know, I learned when I was a kid, about 25 or so, a little older than a kid, that almost everything that I said was one form of lie or another. And the lies were manifold, you know, they were attempts to win arguments for the sake of winning the argument, that might be one. Attempts to indicate my intellectual prowess when there were competitions of that sort. Maybe just the sheer pleasure of engaging in an intellectual argument and winning. My inability to distinguish between ideas that I had read and incorporated because I had read but hadn't realized that I hadn't yet earned the right to use, all of that. And, you know, I had this experience that lasted a long time. Well, I would say it's really never gone away. And I think this was the awakening of my conscience, essentially. And I didn't realize this until much later when I was reading Socrates' Apology. This voice, for lack of a better word, made itself manifest inside me, and it said every time I said something that wasn't true, and that's usually what it said. That's not true. You don't believe that. Or there was a sensation that was associated with it. I don't think this is that uncommon, you know. I asked my psychology classes for many years in a row if they had an experience, this experience, that they had a voice in their head, let's say, it's a metaphor, or a feeling that communicated to them when they were about to do something wrong. And it was universally the case that people agreed with one of those statements or another. And the other thing I would ask is, well, do you always listen to it? And of course the answer to that was definitely no. But that's also very interesting, you know, that you can have this faculty, this conscience. This seems to me to be very tightly associated with the idea of free will, is that you can have this internal voice, this daemon. Well, you know, I learned that so much of what I was doing was false. And I think I learned this. See, there was a reason that this came to me so clearly. I was trying to understand why people did terrible things. And I was really concentrating on the terrible, terrible things that people do. And I was interested in Auschwitz, for example, and not as a political phenomenon, but as a psychological phenomenon. I was curious about how you could be an Auschwitz guard. And I wasn't really curious about how you could be one, because, well, you could be one, of course. I was more curious about how I could be one, being such a good person as I thought I was. But I also knew that many people did many terrible things during the 20th century, and the idea that I was somehow better than them, or that I should assume a priori that I was better than them, and that I wouldn't have made the same choices or worse had I been in the same situation, was a very, very, very dangerous supposition. And in fact, a sufficiently dangerous supposition to bring about the very danger that I assumed was worth avoiding. I had this idea, you know, that what had happened, especially in Nazi Germany, but also in the Soviet Union, shouldn't happen again. That what we needed to do, because of what happened in the 20th century, especially because we also managed to create hydrogen bombs, that we had become so technologically powerful that there wasn't time for that anymore, that time for that was over, and that we really needed to understand why it happened, and that perhaps we could go deep enough in that understanding, which is, I think, what happens when you go deep into understanding, so that you could stop it. Because if you understand a problem, maybe you can solve it, you know, and at least in part, I came to believe that The problem was, as Solzhenitsyn said, that the problem is that the line between good and evil runs down every human heart. For me, it was a matter of understanding that if we want this sort of thing to not happen anymore, then we have to start to become the sort of people who wouldn't do it, which seems rather self-evident, all things considered, unless, you believe that we're the pawns of social forces, for example, like the Marxists do. And I don't believe that, because we're also the creator of social forces. And we're also capable of standing up to social forces, because I would say the individual is more powerful than the social force, all things considered, interestingly enough, that the way to stop such things from happening, the way to remember properly, is to understand that you could do it, that you could do those terrible things, because the people who did them were like you. And that the way out of that is to stop being like that. And the way you stop being like that is, well, at least in part, by ceasing to tell yourself lies that you don't believe in, and that you shouldn't act out. And, and that's made a huge difference in my life, for better or for worse. I mean, it was a very uncanny experience, I would say, because it's very discombobulating to experience yourself as fragmented enough so that much of what you do and say is actually false. It's a lot of work to clean that up, a lot. But the consequences are, in principle, worthwhile. And so that was part of understanding that was part of what drove me towards clinical psychology, saying away from political science and law and from politics in general, because I started to believe that, and I think this is the great Western idea, which people were quite irritated about, by the way, on Q&A last night as well, that the proper route forward for the redemption of the individual and for mankind as a whole is as a consequence of the redemption of each individual. And I truly believe that. And I believe that that occurs as a consequence of adherence to the truth and courage in the face of being. That's rule one, right? To stand up straight with your shoulders back, is to take on the onslaught and to enter the contentious ring and to do more than your best, because your best isn't enough, because your best isn't as good as you could be. You have to push yourself past that. And that's, as far as I can tell, where you find what you need in life. You find the meaning that sustains you in life, and you find the patterns of action that redeem the world, both at the same time. I mean, life is a very difficult business. It's fatal, and it's full of suffering, and it's full of betrayal and malevolence. There's nothing about it that's trivial. It's all profound. And in order to find your way through all of that capacity for hellish experience, let's say, you need to develop a relationship with something that's profound. And you can. You have that capacity. And what could be more profound than the truth? And what would you rather have on your side? And you might say, well, that's obvious, and of course everyone should do that. And then you need to know why you don't. And the answer is, well, sort of encapsulated in this first amusing question, Thank you for enlightening my soul. The burns are still healing. It's like, well, there's no shortage of dead wood to burn off. And there's no shortage of pain when the dead wood burns off. And that's what makes people afraid of the truth. And so, what's the decision that you make? You decide to believe. It's a risk, an existential risk. It's an act of faith. You believe that the truth can set you free. You believe that people have an intrinsic divinity about their soul. You decide that you're going to live in that manner and that you're going to let everything about yourself that isn't worthy of that goal die. And that might be almost everything that you are. And that's a terrible thing to contemplate. The only thing that's worse, I would say, is the alternative. Because the alternative is the sorts of hells that we managed to produce around us and that we produced with particular expertise during the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. And it would be a good thing if we decided collectively and individually not to go back there again. Thank you.